All right. Well, I think we are ready to start our live stream for the month of June. Um, my name is Josh Davis. I am the content manager for Grassroots Economic Organizing. Um, Here with Chris Preciado and Matt Noyes. Would you like to introduce yourself, guys?
Hey, this is Chris helping out with some of the tech. Sometimes, well, I'll also be sharing my 2 cents on things. Kick it over to Matt.
Yeah, this is Matt Noyes in Colorado, member of the GEO Collective. Um, just dropping in for this session.
All right. Um, well, do we have any input from our person who's helping or making sure our sound sounds good?
Um,
Uh,
they said the
as long as
beginning
we got that.
sounded good. I'm waiting on another
Okay.
update.
All right. Well, we'll just go ahead and get started. We haven't had too many problems actually. Even last time when we thought we had a good an echo, it wasn't so bad on the recording. So, yeah, today wanted to talk a little bit about an article that Chris you co-wrote with one Armando, and we just posted it on Geo today, titled "Recommendations for Practicing Language Justice." Um, that was the title I came up with. So if it's a bad title, you can blame me. But I thought it was a pretty good article, and he just had some thoughts. Sounds like you and Armando have been doing translation for social justice movements and stuff like that for quite a while, and had some input for people who want to incorporate that into their work. So I don't know. Want to give us your little elevator speech on this, Chris?
Um, yeah. By the way, our friend says it all sounds good. After hearing
Excellent.
all of us speak, do you want to screen share it? The article?
Oh yeah, I should do that. Let's see.
Yeah, I've kind of already forgotten some of what I wrote. Um, and okay, so yeah, so I don't know if we were gonna write this article um, prior to Aju, I think, or you bring saying that maybe we should write something about it. Um, so the origin of writing it, I think, might have come from Geo. Um, but yeah, I thought it'd be good because I've honestly at this point it seems like the lowest point in that I've seen people being willing to translate. Um, and so we it was a good opportunity for Armando and I to think more about how things need to improve because usually what we do is just kind of gripe about it um, how draining and miserable it is to translate a lot of times. Um, it's always nicer to translate when it's relatives um, or neighbors on the block, but it's when it gets outside of that, it's a lot more difficult. So we wrote up what is it like 13 recommendations or something, and first two are just for like translators to think about, um, aimed at translators, but anybody can look at those to be ready to support them in case translators decide they do want to do this. Um, and the last is for everyone to read. And I feel like the context of this was one where we're talking about translators who have no training, who are just pulled into things, whether it's for their family or social justice movements, because that's how I've seen most translators. It's kind of rare to come across professional translators um, in my normal routine. Um, And so yeah, we're and yeah, and a lot of social justice groups as well. That's what I see. It's I've never, I'm not sure I've ever seen a social justice group hire a professional translator to do anything. It's always relying on who happens to be uh, bilingual or multilingual. Um, so yeah, there's the
And,
article,
and
and go ahead, Josh.
okay, yeah, well, and just to clarify, in your case, when you're talking about translation, are you including also interpretation? Is that is something, or is this just, strictly translating text? Is that what you have done mostly, or
Right, both, both,
okay, both,
and
yeah, yeah.
definitely sign language as well. Um,
Mm.
Bro, maybe that's something that we should have clarified too. Because that's also something that I almost never see as well. There's always a I've never seen social justice groups go so far as to include Braille, or sign language in anything. So maybe that's something that we both overlooked, and that's kind of like a weakness that we ourselves need to address. But yeah, if you have any questions about the article or the recommendations, it was meant for a Chicago audience, but we're like, well, since Geo's is kind of initiated this discussion, let's put up on the Geo website, and then we can just share it from there to our friends in Chicago.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I thought it had some good recommendations. The one that really kind of stuck out to me is a little unexpected, I guess, was the creating an offers list to your group. So creating like doing an offers and needs market, which is a, a a practice where people get together and write down, lists of things that needs that they have, and then things that they can offer to other people, and then try to set people up with to match the offers and needs together. Um, and so, yeah, one of your suggestions in here is to create an offers list for your group, which I thought was pretty, kind of creative way, like trying to think a little bit outside the box of, well, obviously, if people, if organizations have finances to just, pay for these services, that's, certainly what should be done. But there's other ways that, we could, uh, try to remunerate people, even if we don't necessarily have financing for it, because that's certainly something that has come up at Geo. We would love to have, simultaneous interpretation for all of our events and get every single one of our articles translated into every single language, at least Spanish. But that's expensive, and we have one article that we did. We paid a cooperative to do the translation for us. It was pricey. It was not expensive, and certainly not something that's not like in our budget to do for every article. Like, no way. So um trying to, yeah, come up with those other things, I thought was good. Matt, do you have any thoughts as somebody who's worked in this field a little?
Yeah, it's funny. Like I totally identify with what Chris was talking about earlier. Like I remember the first time I got kind of pressed into interpreting, and it was for a group of Spanish-speaking members of a political organization called Solidarity. And my Spanish was terrible. I mean, it was just that at least I had something. That was kind of the standard. So the idea in that case, it was just like, do the best you can. Would just the goal is to facilitate communication, and it may not be perfect, it may not be beautiful, but some level of understanding was the target. Um, and then later, when I lived in Japan, interpreting was a big thing because there was often a question of kind of English and Japanese. That was the issue there, because English was kind of, you could predict would be the language that foreigners in general would probably understand to some extent. So it was the lingua franca for political activism, etc. And the Japanese groups that I worked with, the kind of activist groups and academic groups both, were very principled about paying for interpreting and paying for translation, and took it very seriously. And so there were some really excellent interpreters and translators, and they set very high standard. Sometimes I thought they set the standard too high because, I started out with we're just trying to communicate something. We can just, we can help a little bit. That's at least a step. So there were times when I felt like they needed to, particularly a really close friend of mine who was an excellent interpreter, his standards were just too high. It was like his interpretation was so spot on that very few people could really operate at that level. So that was there was an interesting debate about how good does an interpretation have to be, right? How perfect does it have to be? Sometimes in a couple of events, more of the academic world, people would get outside professional interpreters. And in my experience, they were super proficient, of course, but they weren't that helpful because they typically weren't people involved in the movements. And so they weren't great at, they couldn't think ahead about, okay, here's what the listeners need to understand about this situation for this, what's being discussed to make sense, right? They would just go straight from the text. And that was not actually that helpful. It was sort of better to have people who were a little rough around the edges but understood the movements than to have people who are perfect. But yeah, I'm like, this is all these issues are totally near and dear to me.
Yeah, and I gotta say, it does feel like there's maybe a bit of a chicken and egg issue because I've been at events. I think we've even had an event. I know we have, you know, I've been at events, okay, where there is interpretation offered, and maybe nobody makes use of it, for the session, and and I think and a lot of for a lot of groups that's going to make sense. That's probably going to happen because you're not used to being a group like GEO. We haven't done a whole lot of events that are in Spanish, so why would Spanish speakers who don't speak English be even looking at us in the first place to know that we're offering that? And then it's like if you do that once or twice, and okay, well we hired ICM or whoever to do our interpretation, and we had to pay them, but turned out it wasn't actually needed, or nobody was there who wanted it, and then it makes it kind of hard to justify again, or it makes it difficult to say, oh, should we keep putting money into this when if you're in an organization that's already got a tiny budget. And so if I feel like there's some kind of like outreach as well, maybe, that needs to go along with it, so that just so people know when interpretation services are being offered, so that it doesn't feel like a waste, right?
Yeah, I was just yesterday in the meeting of the solidarity economy principles and practices. What is it called? Community gathering of community. But yeah, that's a good example of what you're talking about. Like there, it was, everything was, there was interpretation into Spanish, and there were, as following a lot of what Chris's recommendations are, which I think are really good recommendations, and they were following a lot of them, in terms of the number of people who were there, the fact that they were prepared and supported, etc. They, I think what made it work is that they actually, it's connected to who the audience is, right? And the participants include people who are operating in Spanish. So it's necessary, it's meaningful, it's not just a gesture or kind of like, in case somebody out there is, needs to hear it in Spanish. It's like very much based on who the people are who are participating. But excellent job. Also, May 1st, dot co-op. They do, again, they have like a real base because they have an organization in Mexico, based in Mexico. And so they're bilingual. It's a bilingual organization. And, they do it 100%. It's like completely on. It's really impressive. But I guess you're right. There is like a total, it makes the most sense. It's the most meaningful when you're really building bilingual or multilingual organizations. Um, that's an important thing to think about. Who are you organizing with, right? It's not just about interpreting. It's about who are you in communication with.
That's a good point though. I know exactly what you're talking about. Um, the whole chicken and egg situation. Um, I guess maybe one thing that might be added to that would be, if it's not stated enough, relationship building with translators, and that's probably where the translator co-op is really important to help hold some of the conversations and facilitate some of that relationship building and understanding about capacity. What I can say for sure is probably one of the difficult things is to ask somebody to set aside time to translate and offer no remuneration, not even like an offers list, and then it's not even needed, and that wasn't indicated ahead of time, that it's a maybe. Um, but yeah, the relationship building is probably something that if I could go back and edit, it's probably what I would add, because that's, yeah, I understand exactly what you're
Mm-hmm.
saying. It's like it's really hard to, yeah, want to be inclusive, not have a budget, not know when it's gonna be needed. But sometimes what I'll do too is I'll just ask people like, "Are you sure there's people gonna show up who are gonna need it? Like, what's the likelihood really?" Um, but things have gotten easier for me when it comes to translating because I it's either I just like translate documents. I mean, what I mostly do is translate documents where there's not really much of a deadline, or the deadline's pretty far, and then I just do like emergency translations, like where I'm on the ground. Um, that system for me is kind of the easiest. Uh, I don't other live interpretation. I really can't. It doesn't really work for me. If it's not an emergency, I just don't want to be part of it. It's how I've drawn my line, but it's a big problem. Maybe part of me drawing my line is also being willing to work with others to help address this translation issue. Um, yeah, check.
Yeah. Um, yeah, yeah, definitely it's something that we need to think about more. And one thing that I think, people have good intentions often, but then we'll kind of, flub it in the execution. Like that's like, I'm hold up. YouTube is not receiving enough video to maintain a smooth streaming. Um, anyway, we're having that error message or shown. So at any rate, we'll, want to be inclusive. And so have somebody get somebody to show up to do interpretation and then it's not needed. Or the thing that I like pull my hair out all the time. I'm often watching videos from conferences or, when I was going to conferences, the interpreters will always say at the beginning to the English speakers, please speak slowly because Spanish takes a lot longer to convey the same information. And I mean, 99% of the time, right? Everybody gets there and like, okay, sure. And then they just go and talk in their regular tone. And, there has to be like, please slow down, please slow down. And that I feel like is something that's just incumbent upon all of us if we're, and especially us native English speakers and monolinguistic clowns, we need to, think like, if we really care, like really think about that. And it is, a skill, just like, doing the interpretations of skills. Like I think we all need to practice the skill of slowing down, speaking slowly. Um, yeah, when we're doing this.
That
Oh, and our
reminds
internet connection is good again. So
that
we'll see.
reminds me of a funny episode where again, when I was really just starting out doing, and I had to do like live, like simultaneous interpretation, Spanish to English, or English. This case it was English to Spanish. Way worse, right? For much more difficult for me. And I was doing, and Ken Paff from TDU was the speaker, and Ken is like a Midwestern kind of guy. He uses lots of metaphors and stories and colorful language and all this stuff. And he went on something about dinosaurs, and I was like, "How on earth am I going to interpret this?" So the people I was interpreting for, I knew them. They're all like activist friends of mine, and I just, instead of interpreting what he was saying, I would just drop into commentary like, oh my god, this is impossible. This guy's talking about dinosaurs. I don't even, I don't know what to tell you. And they were all laughing, and then I'd kind of wait until I could figure out what the point was that I could summarize. But it was really hilarious. Yeah, because he was certainly not slowing down, but not only not slowing down, he was not, making it easy at all. But again, I just think my standard was totally at that point was you just do the best you can. You're just trying to make the room work for everybody who's in it to the degree that you can. And maybe you can do it perfectly, and maybe you can't. And I still think that's like a kind of I think that's an important, from an activist, when you're in an activist setting, that's like a very important principle, I think. Like that's what we're really trying to do, and in academic settings and things like that, it's like you want to be, it's really important to be very, very accurate, right? To be very on target. But I don't know. I think there's sort of somewhat different priorities, maybe, when you're, depending on the context that you're operating in.
Yeah. Speaking of errors, uh, I've seen it to where people want a translator, and then the translator like really, or the interpreter really change their whole schedule to make themselves available, and then it turns out that they didn't even like send, do flyers for the event, inform anybody about the event, and then no one shows. Stuff like that shouldn't. You get to have that stuff in order before you try to get translators or interpreters. But yeah, I see that a lot. You're right, Josh. That's something that maybe should have been included, definitely. But Armando and I, we probably didn't write it because we don't do those events. Most of our translation is written, or it's just on the ground talking to people. And yeah, those events where it's just like where people are just talking, and there can't be like dialogue from others. That's more likely to happen where people are speaking too fast and too much, and too much. I think so, and I think you can kind of tell how collective minded someone is based on how they react in an interpretation situation, because um, and also you can see how monolingual they are, because I think those who are more collectivistic, um, they know it's a lot of work for others. They know that they're taking up a lot of space. That time does get kind of lost or taken up when there's interpretation. So people have to be kind of like to the point, spare the flowery language if possible, if you want to share the floor with other people. And that's kind of one reason why I am unapologetically curt a lot of times. Like I don't employ flowery language, because I think I kind of get into that habit sometimes, because more often, probably more often than the average person, I'm like in a translation situation or interpretation situation, and other people got to speak up, and other people are are interpreting and translating. And but one of the reasons why I think that also makes it hard for the interpreter or the translator, and Matt, I don't know if you come across this too, but I think that when you're bilingual or multilingual, and if you might have like this work ethic or this sense of integrity that you you have the power to lie, if you don't get the translation correct, and like you want to preserve what someone really meant. And I think in the process of interpreting, you realize how much, like in the same language, we communicate without really understanding what someone means. There's like a lot of stuff that it's okay, we don't need to really know what that means. Sometimes we don't even think about it. But in the process of translating, it's harder to resist that type of behavior because you're responsible for not lying and trying to communicate what someone's saying. So then you gotta delve deeper and be like, okay, what do you mean by that? Because that can mean different things. Um, and yeah, that's I guess one of the weird inconveniences or challenges of translation. And I don't know how to that maybe that's one reason why I stay away from certain types of translation too, because I don't like living with that feeling, and it gets all weird if it's like a presentation thing. It's like impossible or awkward to resolve that issue. But if it's in person, everyone's in person, it's easier to resolve that. I don't know if I'm rambling, but check.
Yeah, no, this is all, it's all good information. I think it's good for people to kind of hear the translator or the interpreter's perspective on these things. Because I think a lot of times we just don't think about it. It's like, oh well, we hired an interpreter, we did our job, we did our bit. Don't really think about too much past that. um, One of the things that when I was reading it, that I was thinking, and you kind of hit on a little bit, but the fundraising specifically for interpretation translation services, and I was thinking that it would be nice if it was not something that necessarily every organization, every movement group was, you know, just doing individually, which, you should do that. I think we should probably all be doing that as well. But, if we had, foundations, or if we had some funders or some group that, so if you had a collective of translators there in Chicago, say, it's like, okay, here's, $50,000 for your group, and then to pay you to provide translation services for whoever needs it, right? Because that would, if we're really interested in access, a lot of times I would think that the places where these services are most needed are not necessarily the groups and the places that are going to be able to pay for them, and we still want that to be able to happen. So personally, I would like to see that kind of thing where some of our foundations that might have a little more money, like earmark some of it for specifically for language justice stuff, kind of on the front end, rather than trying to get everybody to work it into their fundraising efforts.
That's like I think that point is interesting to me, because one of the things I noticed, like one big difference between Japan and the US, is that social movement groups in Japan, there's not this whole nonprofit industrial complex there. There are very few nonprofit organizations. Social movement groups typically are very, very unfunded and just run off of dues. And even labor unions at the kind of the bottom level, the grassroots level of labor movement, almost nobody's getting a salary from the union. It's like very, very, the whole movement culture about money is very different. But, the groups I knew, if they were dealing with, if language justice was relevant to what they were doing, they budgeted for it. And this is not because they had a lot of money. It wasn't, it's just kind of, it was kind of a political decision on their part, I think. And I think that's something Chris and Armando's thing that I kind of like. It's like you're kind of putting it out there. It's like if you're going to be serious about this, you're going to have to deal with the fact that it is an expense. It's real. It's like, you know, I don't know. It's like you have to really think about that and whether you want to go, whether you want to deal with it. The other issue that comes up to that came up when we were writing our book, Cooperatives at Work. We interviewed this guy Miguel Yasuyuki Hirota, who writes on alternative currencies and is actually the director of an organization that deals with alternative currencies in Spain. And Miguel is like multilingual, very active in the cooperative world. Um, he's really critical of the European cooperative movement in particular, but also the US and around. He's like in Europe, if they figure if they translate into Spanish and French or English, their job is done. They completely ignore non-European, non-Western languages, essentially. So South Asia, like they have zero capacity for it, and they put very little into translation and interpreting for languages outside of just the sort of European set. Um, so that's a big issue, the whole north-south issue. It's a kind of north-south issue, except that Spanish also bridges that. But that's something I saw that in your piece, Chris, you guys mentioned the also the question of indigenous languages, right? So I know that among activists in Mexico, that's a big deal. Like language justice means taking into account indigenous languages as well and kind of foregrounding them. So that's another that's talk about making it even more challenging, Josh. It's like,
Mm-hmm.
think about having access to a whole series of interpreters, but ultimately, I think that's a kind of
Yeah.
that's what language justice would look like. But Ajwa is here.
Yes. At least her name is here with us. Yeah, I mean it this again, with all the, the different languages, and I live on I live in rural Montana. If language justice around here tends to mean trying to save the native languages, Salish and Kootenai languages here. But we don't, in general, for our groups, it's like everybody here speaks English, so it's not that big of a deal, for us locally. But thinking about other areas, especially urban areas, and then there's there might be a lot of different languages, and that definitely adds to it. And again, which makes me think, like, I really like the fact that, Chris, that you guys started with recommendations for people doing translating, kind of starting there, because that, it's like, okay, so like even in Missoula, not far from me, again, another, it's in Montana. We're not exactly known as the most cosmopolitan place in the world, but that we have a lot of Spanish speaking people in that town. We have a whole Hmong population, um, most of whom are, speak English, but, nonetheless, we've got quite a few African immigrants at this point. And so, it makes me think like there's must be some scope for collective of people who are interested in facilitating this kind of communication between different people, to get together. Um, yeah, that there, there needs to be some organizing among translators who speak different languages, or people doing this kind of stuff, right? Um, because it does get to be a huge just logistics issue, right? If you do, it's like, okay, we want to make sure we're including everybody, so we've got to present this in Spanish and English and French and Waddle and right. It could be a little bit complex. So, um, but definitely deciding first that we want to at least engage in this in a serious way is the first step, which I think most of us, like a lot of us, we don't even think about it.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah, I like that idea that you had, Josh, about um, getting. You said like some sort of like fund that bestows translation funds to other groups. Um,
Hmm.
Armando and I, we didn't talk exactly about, we didn't talk in too much depth about the idea of groups fundraising. Um, but one and that's, I think that's, for some groups I think that's the case, that they might not really have the capacity to really fundraise. Though there is one organization that I'm aware of historically that part of joining the org was you had to fundraise. That was like part and parcel of joining the org. Um, but I think that like in Chicago, I've seen some incredible fundraising, and I'm surprised at times the amount of money that people can raise, um, from not even having a an organized fundraising system. Um, and I think there's so much potential, and there's probably one idea that comes to mind though about this idea of fundraising is maybe groups can just set aside some maybe some groups can just set aside some funds or contribute offers list as part of like fundraising. Maybe it's not something that they, you know, to put too much labor and set us. Maybe it's not something they set aside too much time to do, but it's one way that they're leading into developing a better like fundraising practice. And maybe it is a different group or groups outside of one's group that kind of bottom lines fundraising and pulls together resources. Um, I don't know, but I think there's so much potential. And it doesn't have to be fundraising just for translation either. I almost all groups that I see, they they need a fundraise, but they're not doing it, and they could go toward other things too. It might solve many of their other problems if they lean into it.
Is Adjoa
Um,
with us?
I think Audra is just listening in. I think she may
Oh,
have.
okay.
Um,
That's cool.
uh, it, yeah, it makes me think we need something though, like I think it's the Howard Bowers Fund, which I'm
Hmm.
not sure if it's still a thing, but I think that's what it was called. And I got a scholarship from them one time, but they're basically a co-op education foundation, and what they do is just give people money to go to conferences, right? So like people like myself who normally maybe wouldn't be able to afford the travel and all the expenses to go into a conference, they provide scholarships for people to do that. And it'd be great if there were a fund like that uh, for language justice stuff that you could say, hey, we're having an event, we really like to, we think we could be good to have some translation or some interpretation, and you know uh, be able to go to one place because for that's specifically for this. Just a thought. um
I think these are great. That idea and the offers and needs idea, I think, are great. Because I do think another sort of like angle on this that gets tricky is because of this phenomenon of, wealth concentration, which has led to also more money available for philanthropy, which has created a kind of enhanced this sort of nonprofit fundraising, I mean, big fundraising, foundation, grants, etc., world in that culture. I think that's come with a certain professionalization among the nonprofit, in particular the nonprofit sector, where everybody feels like they need to be making, you know, $80,000 a year on a full-time job, $90,000 a year, or everybody needs to become a director of their department and make 100,000. There's all this kind of, and so very legitimately, interpreters and translators ask for money, as they should, and yet it also is hard not to get swept up in that thing of, well, how much, right? And it's like, well, if you're interpreting and you're working for an organization that's paying its people these kind of salaries, then they ought to be paying that kind of salaries for interpretation, right? But then for small movement groups, that's totally inaccessible, right? So there needs to be a sort of I don't know. There's some room for a kind of struggle on that issue, I guess. I don't know that there's an easy answer or equation, but it's an
Yeah.
interesting challenge.
Yeah, I think that might intimidate people because then it starts introducing the question of, well, I do free work. Should I get paid too for the free work?
Right?
Um,
Hmm.
and I don't think it's something that people should shy away from, as scary as it might seem, because I think it should just, it might lead to the kind of intimacy that a lot of groups need, a lot of honesty and kind of like
Hmm.
understanding what other
Mm,
people are going through that's needed. Because I know some it's very few, but I know some translators who are like, man, I don't need any money. I'm good.
right.
Um, I can keep doing this for free. It's just a matter of time. It's just time management.
Mm,
But there are some who are, many who are in a totally different place, who are like,
yeah.
I need the money.
Yeah.
Because there's big opportunity costs involved. Um, I'm DACA. I couldn't work for many years, or
Hmm.
the process of naturalization was very expensive, and
Yeah. Yeah. I wanted to mention something, Chris, about because you're talking about the whole like translator dilemma about, the need, the honesty, the kind of responsibility to be honest and accurate, right? To accurately represent something, and yet people don't always understand each other clearly. There's a great book by this guy Daniel Hahn called Catching Fire, and he translated a novel by a Chilean writer, Diamela Eltic, and he kept a diary while he was translating the novel, and so he also published the diary. And it's fun to read because it's really, really honest. It's a very, very honest portrait of like what the work is, and so he includes his first draft. Here's what it looks like when I first go through a text, and it's a disaster. Right? Like it's a total mess. And then he shows himself wrestling with things and making decisions, and talks about a lot of the issues, including like the fact that there's not a single right answer, right? There are different ways you could go, especially in literary translations. But he described translating as like somebody gives you a watercolor and they ask you to reproduce it in pen and ink, but they want it to be exactly like the watercolor.
Right.
So it's like, well, what are you gonna do? But that book was fun to me to read because it was just like I felt there were so many things in there I recognized. I was like, oh yeah, I'm glad to know somebody else does this thing too. It was totally entertaining.
Yeah, the question of the inequality within the movement and who's getting paid for what and how much and doing work for free. I don't know where this really fits in, but reminds me of something. I can't remember who it was. It was a woman of color. I remember this, who is old now and had done a lot of work in the civil rights era. And I just remember her saying, making some comment about, finding it a little bit odd how the younger people now, everybody, require like is it being insistent on being paid for all of their movement work. Like that became a thing. And she's like, we we were just in it for the movement. It's like we were like, think about Ella Jo Baker or somebody like that. Like if she had only, if she'd been like, well, you can't pay my salary anymore, I can't work anymore, like we wouldn't have a lot of the organizing that she was responsible for just wouldn't have got done because she wasn't doing it for this for the salary. And I feel like there is something to that. It maybe sounded like a little bit of a boomer being like, kids these days sort of thing, but I think there is something to it. I mean, I've personally, like, I do a lot of work, most of the work I do for Geo is not compensated. A little bit of it is, most of it's not. And I, it's, I'm in it for the movement. I'm not, it's, yeah, I need to, pay the bills like everybody else, but, that's not the major deciding factor in how much time I'm putting into things. Um, but on the other hand, I also understand that I'm a privileged to be able to do that. Like I don't, I'm a single man. I don't, have other, a whole lot of financial responsibilities outside of myself to take care of. Um, so, I have the freedom to be able to do that, and not everybody does. But, you know, I think if we want any kind of real transformative movements, like it can't, the revolution will not be funded. Uh, as the famous book says. So we have to be okay with that on some level. But then on the other hand, the situation has changed, and back in the 1960s and 70s, single wage earner household could provide a middle class standard of living for a family of four, and that's not the case anymore. And so things that maybe were possible before, maybe not quite so possible now. And this is where to me, I keep thinking that the real solution has to lie in solidarity. That we're not going to be able to figure out how to just hand out enough individual paychecks to everybody to make it just and work. Okay, we're going to have to think beyond that somehow. So again, the offers and needs market stuff, and just kind of I don't know, thinking more about, okay, we're part of a movement that we're trying to do something, and we want to take care of each other, and figuring out how we're going to do that, and getting over the mentality. It's like, okay, yeah, I do need to pay my bills, but everybody else does too, and we're trying to do as much as we can with what money we have. So in my mind, the idea is everybody in the movement, you should be trying to reduce the amount of money that you need to live, so that you can leave enough in the, as much as possible in the kitty to do the movement work. And so that's, kind of a foreign concept in our country for sure. But I don't know, I feel like there are issues around a lot of our funding that kind of come down to this stuff, where it's we're kind of stuck in our traditional ways of looking at things and thinking about them. But at any rate, we've been talking about this for a while. Does anybody want any closing thoughts?
I just wanted to add something to your last point, which I think is a really good one, which is, the movie Treasure of the Sierra Madre, the B. Traven novel.
I'm only 43, Matt. I
Well, it's an oldie. John Huston, maybe he made the movie. Anyway, Humphrey Bogart, whatever. There's an old guy who's the old wise prospector, and he gives this elegant explanation of Marx's theory of value without calling it that, in this Hollywood movie based on a novel by B. Traven, who is the great anarchist writer who moved to Mexico and wrote a whole series of novels about Mexico, particularly about Chiapas, about that area. But anyway, he in this one, there's just one scene where they're trying to figure out how to handle. They're going to go gold prospecting, and how do we handle the goods, and how do we handle everything? And the guys they're all getting, the two young guys that this old guy is working with, they're all getting worked up about formulas or ways to calculate this, or what are we going to do, and who's going to pay for what. And the old guy just says, I think it's better not to put everything on a money basis. And of course, they immediately proceed to put everything on a money basis, and it all goes to hell. But I always remember that line, because I really think that is important. And I feel like more and more I'm beginning to understand and I'm trying to translate it into practice, like what you said. How do we put things on a solidarity basis? Constantly move that direction, and away from this idea that if I do something and I'm not paid for it, that represents either exploitation or charity. Like I'm either being charitable or I'm getting ripped off. And it's we know that there's another way to think about the contributions that we make and the way that we work and how we help each other. That isn't either, it's not limited to those two options. But the money economy makes you really think that if you're not getting paid, you're getting ripped off, or you're being charitable. It's just that's a very limited way of thinking. So I like this. That's an interesting thing to talk about. It'd be very interesting to talk more about kind of how you practical examples of that. But this is a good one.
Yeah. Um,
Chris.
yeah, Chris, this was your article. You want any closing thoughts for us?
Um, yeah, I think what I see with uh, translators, interpreters, uh, mostly amateur ones, but whatever. I feel like one thing that's really diminishing capacity is that there's like what I call like a hypo selfishness. Like there's not enough sense of self. That a lot of people do stuff for free and they burn themselves out, not realizing that maybe it's not money that's needed, but some type of solidarity is needed, and that's all I was hoping that um, the article would help to build a bridge to by getting people just to talk about this stuff more and find the answers along the way. Um, that's why the offers and listing was needed too. Like, yeah, for sure, it's not all about money. It's about getting just better at what we're doing. Um, yeah. So yeah, I agree too. It's really more about just being better at being considerate and supporting each other and
Mm-hmm.
hearing each other out, figuring out what we need,
Mm-hmm.
how we need
Yeah.
to adjust to get better, and taking care of each other to take care of others.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, for sure. I mean, and something I've noticed, I'll just add because I can't keep my mouth shut. That when it comes to doing volunteer labor, um, and I'm sure this is not, I know this is not true completely across the board, but it seems like, there's at least something to this dynamic of just as with anybody who's done, fundraising for charitable or political organizations like as I have done, one thing you find out is that the less money people have, the more charitable they are, the more generous they are with it. And so I did a lot of door knocking when I was in college 20 years ago for Montperg and various like environmental and consumer good government organizations, and always the best neighborhoods to go do fundraising in were the poorest ones because there were for whatever reason, um, people with less money, I don't know, they care more, or they don't hold on to it so much, and it kind of, to me, it seems like there's maybe some of that same dynamic in like who's doing a lot of work, for free and getting burnt out. My guess, and I know zero statistics to back this up or anything, but is that same kind of dynamic. It's going to be mostly lower income people with fewer resources who are really in it because we fucking believe in this, and so we get asked to like go out of our way and do some extra stuff for free. It's like, oh yeah, we'll do it. Whereas people who are used to being paid and paid well for everything they do, it might have more of that attitude of like, oh, this is charity that I'm performing or something like that, and so not feel so in required to say yes, and then therefore don't get burnt out and don't see this as much of an issue. um and those of us who like really need this movement to be a real thing and to be creating real change, it's like, yeah, we're willing to do it for nothing, just to do it because it's the right thing to do. It needs to get done, and I yeah. So anyway, I could go on and on about that, but just one more aspect. Um, so we're 5 minutes from the hour. So we spent a whole hour almost, Chris, talking about this. And before we started, like, oh, talk about your article. I don't have much to say about it. Well, um, it's a very big issue, but I did want to get something else that just Chris, you'd put out in an email that came up in looks like conversations with other co-op folks. This idea of and I'll just read directly from the notes that you put in the email. Funding super extracted people with a full income in their first year or years of being in a new co-op versus the approach of assuming people have a very privileged background to go without income. So this kind of issue that's come up, and I know we've mentioned it before in these conversations, about that, it's, even though worker co-ops have a better success rate than traditional businesses, it's still risky. It costs money, it costs time. And if you're, a low income person working manual labor jobs, that's a big lift, and especially, when it's, you've got people on the development end of things who are making nonprofit, salaries, maybe, um, so asking people with little resources to contribute those and to put them at risk, to start a co-op, maybe could be a little bit problematic, right? So I don't know. Any thoughts on that? I don't want to ramble forever, but
Um, well, I guess the first. So I heard Jim Johnson talking about that, and it was something that I've been thinking about as well, and I've been wondering if there's any kind of like analysis or research done about what role that might play in the success of any of worker co-ops or any co-ops. Um, but I was one thing that came to mind though is just being grateful to be around Jim, um, people and people who have like this who've been around and kind of seen patterns. And that's one of the things I like about Geo is that some folks have been around for a while, and a lot of questions that just aren't getting answered. It's kind of sometimes it's easier to find out some answers from talking to y'all. Um, so I was just grateful I to see the value of Geo, because y'all know a lot of things that other folks in Chicago just aren't talking about, or like I'm not gonna bump into them and have these conversations um, off the cuff. But yeah, I wonder like are there, it's what has anybody made any progress in trying to has anybody attempted trying to create those types of models in the past? What happened? Are there now like I want to see when in 5 or 10 years time a fund is just to like let's experiment with giving extracted people, more extracted people, uh, all this money to start up. Would it financially even be worth it? How much money gets poured into helping some worker co-ops, but this ends up getting wasted because it folds compared to what if something like this happened? Would it actually be in the long run more financially viable? And I use the term super extracted just because like the idea of poor people is a lot of, I mean, I'm not going to grill anybody for using the term poor people, but I just like to remind myself that a lot of people, they've been taken away from, or they're repressed. Or their abilities are suppressed. There's so much that people can do, but are just held down in so many ways. But yeah, check.
yeah, well, I don't know, man. I'll stick up for that one. Speaking as somebody with, who rarely breaks four figures in their bank account, um, from like the first to the third of the month. um, to me, it's just like it's just what it is. Like
Yeah.
it's just a descriptive word. There's no judgment involved in it, but yeah, it's, this is something that's kind of near and dear to my heart because I've seen it, you know, in person, like people who I encouraged, like they wanted to start a business, but I encouraged them to do it. They wanted to do a co-op. I encouraged that. I helped them do it, helped them get it set up. And, out of the four people who started that business, only one of them still, it's now a sole proprietorship because one dude ended up with the business, and three of those people ended up contributing time and money and walking away with not, I mean, experience, you know, how not to do things in a worker co-op. And so for me, it's like I almost feel like, all right, well, you guys would have done this anyway. It wasn't like my idea, thankfully, or anything like that. But still, it's like, God, I hope I, didn't lead somebody astray or give them some idea that ended up, leading them to do something they regret. So there is somebody, Chris, though we do have data on this kind of system in the U.S. And the closest thing we have, I think, is Arizmendi, the Arizmendi Association. Started with the cheese board bakery, converted to a worker co-op in, I don't know, the 70s or the 80s or something, and then they have expanded and have grown from one worker co-op bakery to half a dozen in the Bay Area. And how they've done that is not by going out and talking about how great worker co-ops are and convincing some people to start up a worker co-op. No, they go out, they, identify an area of town that could, support one of their businesses. They provide the funding, from the association, provides all the startup funding. And then a couple of people from an existing worker co-op kind of start the new one, hire people, just, like any other type of job, you hire people, for the business, and teach them how to run the co-op and teach them everything. But the people who are, those first hires for the new co-op, they're not having to put in, buy a membership or go through a bunch of business training or anything like that. They're just going to work at a bakery. They're getting all that training, on the job. And they're very successful. I don't know. There may have been, a bakery that they tried to start up and it failed, but I haven't heard of it. They seem to be very successful with this system, and then they have this system built into where when they, set up a new co-op, then that co-op, once it's, profitable, puts back some small percentage of its gross revenue or net revenue into the association to do this process again. And I think that's what I really think. I would love to see that. I think Arizmendi has a model that's really, really amazing. And it's not unique, but in the US it kind of is. And I would love to see it scaled up on a national level, something like that, where it's like, we're not just going and talking to people. Because like me, when I came into the worker co-op when I was a house painter, right? I'm just a construction guy. I don't know anything about business. I don't know any of this stuff. And it's like, it feels like rather than going out and talking to people like me, just like random workers and trying to convince them hey, starting your own business is a great idea. Not, doing the Arizmendi thing. It's like, okay, people who know what the heck they're doing and have the funding are setting up a business, and, and they're cooperators. So it is, it's going to be a legitimate co-op. I just think this would be such a better way to go than, again, trying to convince people, get people trained, first of all, on how to start a business, and then, make them put their money at risk. I actually wrote a blog about this. Sorry, I will stop here. It just I just remembered I wrote a blog about this some years ago, and I don't know if I used this term or not, but it was the title was something like why we need a co-op failure fund. And my idea there was that, look, when somebody tries to start a worker co-op, and it works, well, that's great, and everybody is like, yay. And but when somebody tries to start a worker co-op and it fails, that's also good information. It's like a scientific experiment, right? It's like, okay, you rejected or you didn't reject your null hypothesis or whatever. You didn't get the result you were expecting, but now you know something that you didn't before. And it's this, it's like in the co-op movement, I feel like it's the same thing. People who try to start a worker co-op one way, doesn't work. That's valuable information for the whole movement, for the rest of us, and we should not, like, the cost and the expense of that failure should not just rest on those people who took that risk. Like, if we really wanted to encourage lots of worker co-ops, we would, have some kind of fund to reimburse people for, your co-op that failed, something like that.
I love the idea of like somebody. I could just picture writing the grant application to the failure fund, where the way you're going to get the money is by proving just how badly you messed up.
Yeah.
Like, we really deserve this money because let me tell you how big a mistake we made. But it's actually, in theories of entrepreneurship and all that stuff, totally right. The whole idea is you should support people who fail, because that's absolutely where you want to be. You want to be in that edge where things aren't always successful. So it's, it's a fun idea. I would love to see it. It would be totally great. It's a
Ajua
smart idea.
Ajua put a heart. Does that mean Ajua is able to say something? um, but yeah, I'd be curious to see how that would work out. Um, I wonder if it could be a way to also kind of save the relationships in the co-op from um, getting too strained or irreparably damaged. Like,
Mm-hmm.
because I wonder if when people fail, I wonder if there's a bunch of like internal, like, how do you say, internalized oppression, because a lot of it's like it's not people's fault that we're in this situation. People long time ago and today are putting us in this situation, and we felt it's not our fault. We were set up for failure. And maybe such a fund can help people to realize that, and also, it might be a good, how to say, like, consolation prize. It's gonna go to help out more people, and maybe it's a way to keep them in the movement instead of disappearing.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah.
what kind of did the article talk about any ideas of how, like, the fund might work, like what questions might be asked or qualifications?
Oh, no, I didn't want to like go into like thinking about it in detail. It's just some random wild hair I thought was a genius idea, so I wrote about it. Um, but no, I mean, there are a lot of questions and something like that, right? You have to set it up so it's not going to be easily gameable. Like, it'd be like I become a serial cooperapreneur, and just everything happens to fail, but we all get paid out anyway, or something like that. But I mean, I would think like I don't know, in my dream world or whatever, if I just was given tasked with setting this up, I think it would be something like, okay, when you want to set up a co-op, you have to go through a certain amount of training, if you're gonna like be covered by this, or if you want to like have like use it as a way to kind of enforce some sort of best practices, to give people the best opportunity to actually succeed and not have to, because that's what
Mm-hmm.
we're wanting. Yeah. So, but yeah, I would think, like, maybe on the front end you would want some kind of you know so, some kind of filtering mechanism, or something like that, um, because there are certainly a lot. Well, and then there's also the thing of like, okay, it's not like Matt was saying, oh, you apply for the fund and show how terrible everything was. It's like, no, I mean, if you apply for the fund and you're like, well, we kind of half-assed our decision making, and we never came up with a conflict resolution process, and we didn't actually do any market surveys and stuff like that. It's like, well, no, you you don't get access. Like, you didn't do the basics, right? So trying to make sure people do that. Um,
I see. So it's a failure fund, not like a dumbass fund.
Right. Yes, exactly. But then, it could also be like, say, if you're going to set up a co-op, you want to have like the insurance of like, okay, if this doesn't work out, we can at least get our money back from the failure fund. And so you apply for that in advance, and, you get checked out, and maybe some people who with actual business knowledge, you get a Jim Johnson or somebody like that to look at your business plan and say, you know what, this seems like it's got a really low chance of succeeding. Like, we don't want to sign on to that. Um, to take care, because I think that is something that I've noticed in worker co-ops and just small business in general. There are a lot of bad ideas. There are a lot of bad business ideas out there for, just ideas that sound good, but they're just not going to work out in practice. I think like way more bad business ideas than good ones. And this is again, listening to the guy from Works co-op, Brian, I believe his name is, talking about going to this, um, uh, you know, co-op failure seminar, a couple of co-ops, like 3 or 4 co-ops that had, tried and failed. We're going to do this like, debriefing and what happened. And he went and he's like, and I didn't hear anything at all about, I just heard like 4 bad business ideas. Like, it wasn't like the co-op part that was the problem. It was like, well, that's just an idea that doesn't seem like it's going to really work. And so like I think that we could be helped by that as well, because if somebody gets sold on the co-op idea and they have an idea for a business that they think is great, and then they just go whole hog into it, and it turns out, well, actually the business idea was the problem, they might then end up thinking like, oh, it's the co-op that's the problem. So you could maybe get a little kind of guidance of people to hopefully make them more successful, give them a better chance of being successful, and then if they're not, have the safety net there so you don't totally lose your shirt.
Doesn't it bother you though that a lot of bad ideas for businesses thrive? Like, you ever see that?
Well, oh yes.
Good point. Good point.
I mean,
on that one.
Like, people are buying that.
Yeah. Well, this is the problem. I mean,
Sure.
we even have bad business ideas that people they think are highly successful business ideas because they're everywhere, like Uber, for instance, which has lost billions of dollars every single year and has never made any money and has no way to make money. But people think it's successful because it's everywhere. And it's like, no, they're only everywhere because they have billions of dollars of investor money to burn. And I see that, happening in the co-op world, especially with platform co-ops. But I think just, in general, you see some business, it's like the new hotness, like, oh, this is the bandwagon everybody's jumping on. And, you think like, because they're everywhere, like they must be making buku bucks. But when you look into it, it's like, oh no, they're just burning through funds, running at a loss. And so, again, I think we could maybe stop. There are definitely some co-ops that have gotten a lot of press that I really wish like people would have talked to me beforehand, or some of us who are like, let's check out your business model, because the people you're basing your thing on don't have one. Right. But yeah. But yeah, a lot of times things that I think would be dumb do actually end up working. So I don't think I should be the person saying whether it's a good business idea or not. There are other people who are more.
Also, if they're on that, the thing is, like, if you're on the edge of, like, particularly in that space where you're trying to do something different, then it's not so clear what's a good idea, what's not a good idea. It's just, and that's okay. Like, that's that's all right to have. In Tokyo, there was a group called Impact Hub. I think they're all over the world, and it's these little entrepreneurs, sort of like co-working space entrepreneur group thing. But one of the things they did, they had every Friday night or once a month was Fuck Up Fridays, and somebody would come and present about their disaster, and it was great. It was like they were celebrating. It was like a totally celebratory event. Like, you'd go and you would describe your disaster, and people would like cheer you on, ask you lots of questions. And I do think it has a good impact of helping you clarify where the failure is. Like, because like you said, the group I worked with here who had the organic gardens co-ops, the landscaping co-op, totally great business model. That wasn't their problem at all. The fact that it was a co-op wasn't the problem. It was just difficulties that come from conversion to a co-op that are hard, and that were harder than any of us, including me, because I was helping them, really understood until it got to a point where it was kind of too late to fix. So it's like, it's good to analyze those things and to talk about them, so you can start to see, oh, it's not that the business model was bad. It's not that the co-op was bad. It's that this piece needs a lot more work than we even anticipated. So yeah, I think it's good. That's good practice.
Um, I feel like the what Matt said earlier about it not being a dumbass fund. I feel like that might be a good fundraiser idea. Like I don't know, some kind of shirt to fundraise for that for the failure fund. Like I don't know, we're not dumbasses or something like that. I don't know,
Right.
but it's the seed of what could be a really great fundraising tool. Or
Yes. It's for the tryhards, not the dumbasses, you know.
I'm committed to not
Like,
being a dumbass or something
yeah.
like that. But yeah, I wonder, do y'all have it in you right now to admit to a mistake that you've made in the past week? I wonder if maybe
In the past week? Oh my God. That's a lot to pick from.
would y'all be interested in doing that now, picking out something? We'll do our own little fuck up
Sure.
Friday on a Monday. On a Monday.
Sure. I've been doing the trim, repainting the trim on a house in town here. And the other day I took down three or four of the rain gutters so I could easily paint underneath them and thought, hey, no problem, I'll just leave them down until I get back to fix it. And don't you know, the next 3 days it just rains nonstop, and I feel like an idiot because I didn't go over and put them back up. I did get them up, but I felt like an idiot because I was being a little bit lazy instead of waiting for the paint to dry and putting them back up the same day. I thought I'll just leave them down, and sure enough, we were having hail and rain, and uh, no damage was done. But
I got one. It's not real serious, but happens all the time. I work on this farm on Mondays, and I'm always in dread of screwing something up because it's a production farm. It's like has serious. If you mess something up, it's major consequences. So today what was I doing? I was weeding a row where we're going to plant melons, and I'm like, I have this bucket full of weeds. I'm like, what do I do with these? And so I marched him over to the compost pile. And luckily, right at the moment I was about to dump them on the compost pile, I thought, you know, maybe this isn't right what I'm. So I dumped them on the
yeah,
side next to the compost pile. And then a little bit later, I had another bucket full, and the farmer asked me, where are you going to take those?" And I was like, "Well, over to the composting." She's like, "You don't put bindweed in the compost pile unless you just want to grow bindweed forever." It
right.
was just kind of like, so that I do things like that all the time. So that was, but actually, just on a little side note, just because I have to say it, it was today we had unbelievable thunderstorms. And on the way back, it was like hail, like I've only seen like a couple times in my life, where you almost can't drive at all. And unfortunately, they got hit, so they lost just about everything that was in the field. So things are in the greenhouses are all right, but it looks like we're going to have to be replanting. Um, so that that's the brutality of farming.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That doesn't count as a fuck up. That's just like, you know,
No.
Mother Nature can be a dumbass. That's what that is.
Well, it kind of reminds of my fuck up. I think part of my fuck up comes from the weather being so weird. It just threw me out of sync. I was doing painting and trying to get the right temperature, um, do it at the right temperature when there's not rain. But for some reason in San Antonio, like the weather just keeps forecasting it's gonna rain like every day, and then it doesn't rain, and so that's like really it threw me off. I think I'm not used to that. Um, but uh, I was putting sealant on a fence, and I I think because the dial for the sealant, I was putting because I think I had it improperly um dialed to where it's just shooting a lot of the liquid, a lot of the sealant. I kind of ended up in the situation where I have extra sealant, but it's not quite enough to do like a second coat. It would be very uneven, and so I think I would say like I wasted some money on getting some extra sealant because like I don't want to do that. It's gonna be uneven. Um, I should have really. I wished I would have just dialed it correctly. I wish I would have remembered to diet to test, and measure how much was coming out and if I was gonna have enough. But I think it's also just kind of doing too much by myself is the reason why I did that. But the good thing is that I found somebody who will be able to make use of that extra sealant that I have. I was like, oh, thank goodness. Because I don't know if you ever in that situation where you're like, I don't want this stuff to dry up, whether it's like caulking or, yeah, extra paint, extra like mineral spirits or something. It's going to be 10 years before I ever use this again, or I'm never going to use it again. Like, I wish I could just go to the department store and there was a place where you can put your surplus and then other shoppers can be like, oh, I need that. Let me take that. But I think that's probably like something they would not like for you to do. But yeah, that was my fuck up. But it was cool listening to your fuck ups though. I feel like it was a little intimate.
Yeah. Oh, well, yeah, I can certainly relate, Chris. Before I scored the gig at Geo, I was working a lot of years painting houses with a buddy, and spraying a lot of stuff on. And man, sprayers are finicky. There's a lot of stuff to know. Um, all right. Well, now that we've all disclosed our failings,
we just scratched the surface.
oh no, I'm sure that's
Yeah.
it. Nobody's ever done anything worse than what we just talked about.
I mean, I have two more, but whatever.
Right. Okay. All right. Well, we will wrap this up. We're over an hour and 20 minutes. The time just flies when the conversation is good. So,
all right,
yeah.
you guys. Thanks for
being here and
letting me be here. We got to get Aljoa back in. She's so good.
Yeah.
And
keep
nice
her
that
from
Aljoa is
talking
here.
so much.
Hey, there
All
we
right.
go.
Cameo.
Yeah, right at the end.
Guys, great discussion. I loved it.
All right.
Nice to see you.
Yeah. Thanks. Same here.
Say goodbye, and we're ending the stream.
Bye.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.